Hello, my name is Matthew Marquit and welcome back to the Unwrapping in 3D Studio Max video tutorial series. In this particular video titled Unwrap Modifier and Editor Basics, we're going to learn a little bit about the tools themselves. So not necessarily the unwrap process, but the tools found in the Unwrap UVW modifier. And of course, all of the stuff that we can find in the editor itself. So let's jump into Max and get started. Alright, so if we obviously want to get into the Unwrap editor, we got to add one. So the first thing I'm going to do is select my object, come over here to the Modify tab, and click the Unwrap UVW modifier. After that, I'm going to click on the Open UVW Editor button. This is what it looks like inside the editor itself. As you can tell, I already did my unwrap. I'm going to grab the corner of my window here and pull it out to get a little bit more real estate. Now, in order to navigate around inside the editor, you have a couple of options. One such option is clicking the middle mouse button, holding it down to pan around. Then you can use the middle mouse button scroll wheel to zoom in and out. However, you can tell that it's kind of popping a bit while it's moving. If you'd rather have a nice smooth zoom instead, hold down Control Alt and press down middle mouse button while moving up and down to get a more controlled zoom. And finally, if you make a selection and press the Z key, you can center that selection within the window. If nothing is selected and you press the Z key, it will zoom extents. It will also zoom extents if you have, say, a selection way off in space. Click off of it, have nothing selected, and hit it again. You'll see that it will center all the UVs within the viewport. Alright, so let's talk about some visual options within the editor. Now first and obvious, UVs are in 2D. I've kind of mentioned that in my previous video. You can also see the UV box that's within the center of my editor here that represents the workable area in which your texture is being represented. If I put my UVs outside the box, then I intend on them repeating, like in the case of a tiling texture. However, on this model, I'm obviously doing a texture sheet. As we can see, all of my UVs have been compacted into the box within the editor. You may have also noticed that within the UV box itself, there's a checker pattern being displayed behind the UVs. You can control what's being displayed in the editor with this drop-down menu here, as I showed in the previous video. You can also completely shut it on or off by pressing this button here. If I turn it back on, but I want it to repeat several times, I can click this button here. However, this only repeats if I have my UV islands within those spaces. So if I was to say grab some of the UV islands here and move them, you can now see whatever my UV islands are encompassing. I now have checkered textures in all of those same spots. You can also repeat the texture without the UVs being in that space by clicking on this button here and going down to where it says Tile Bitmap and clicking the check mark. Now if you look over in our UV space, you'll see it's repeating multiple times around the object. That's controlled by the section called Tiles over here, which is by default set to 1. If you increase it to 2 and so on, you can see you can tile it even more within the space. Once you're done, hit OK to commit to the option. So now let me talk about some of the default colors found within the UV editor, which include green for the seams, white for normal lines, and blue for shared subcomponents. At the moment, I don't have anything selected, so we're not going to see any of that blue. But if I decide to grab any of these UVs, including these over here in the corner, we begin to see blue all over our object. This blue represents, as the name insinuates, objects that are actually sharing subcomponents within the model themselves. So if I say grab just one edge, you can see this edge over here turn blue. This actually means that this edge on the UV island in the top right and the UV island down here are actually the same edge on the model itself, but have been split in the UV editor to create different UV islands. Now, if you're looking to change any of these default colors, you can head back over to this option box again, open it up, and we can see the different swatches here, such as the seams. In fact, we can even hide the seams by clicking this check mark, or bring them back by clicking it again. If I click on the color swatch below it, it'll bring up this dialog that allows me to change the color to whatever I want. You can see it change in real time. Of course, I can always reset it or cancel it. I don't need to go with it. But if you guys want, you obviously have the ability to change any of the colors you want within this options box. You can also see the normal line color here, and of course the show shared subs here. You can also turn them on and off with this checkbox. You can also add a grid by clicking on here and change the color of the grid with this swatch underneath it. And finally, you can change the background color here, just the same as with anything else. So the next topic I want to cover is selecting UVs. If you look in the bottom left corner, we have a vertex mode, an edge mode, a polygon mode, and an element toggle mode. Selecting UV subcomponents works exactly the way you'd expect them to. If I say zoom up here and in polygon mode, go and grab a polygon, you can see I can select just one. If I want to add to that selection, I can hit Control to continue to add or take away from that selection by pressing and holding Alt. I can also do a box selection if I click and drag, and don't forget your crossing mode found up here that lets you choose how the box selection works. If I say select it here so that it's in windowed mode, only what's fully inside my selection will be selected, and if I go back here and set it to crossing and come back in, anything within my selection will be selected. And finally, if we go down and toggle the element mode here, it will select an entire UV island. So if I say select with poly and element mode on, you can now see that it will completely select this element. If I pick edges, it'll do the same thing. And of course, vertices just the same. Just be sure to shut it off if you don't want to grab the entirety of a UV island. You can also grow and shrink selections using these buttons here. For example, if I was to say grab a polygon in the middle of this UV island, I can click the grow button to make it larger, and of course the shrink button to make it smaller. I can also say go into edge mode and use both the loop and ring tools found here. If I click on an edge and click the loop UV button, we can grab the entirety of the loop. Keep in mind that double clicking will do the same thing as far as a loop is concerned. If I say click just one edge, I can also grow the selection or shrink it using these buttons, and the same can be said with rings. If I can click on a edge right here, we can either grab the entire ring set, I can undo that, or I can grow it, or of course shrink it. And the last tool is the paintbrush tool, which allows me to paint selections or deselect with the Alt key. Another useful tool could be found lower here, which is our freeze and our unfreeze tool. If I say grab a selection, we're going to go over here and add element mode and grab this entire object, I can freeze it. This now prevents me from selecting or manipulating in any way. If I want to unfreeze it, I just go back, click on the little fire emblem, and now it's all available for selection and manipulation again. It's also important to note that you don't have to select UVs just in the editor. You can select them directly on the model. You can see over here that if I grab any of the polygons within the model itself, you'll see it also be selected within this window. Of course, the vice versa works just the same. You can see over here on the side that we have our vertex, edge, polygon, and toggle element mode over here, and grow and shrink selections, along with looping and ringing. But we also have some other selection tools that can help us while selecting on a model. We can see down here that we can select by ignoring back faces. So if I say I only want the stuff in the front of my selection, I rotate around, nothing's selected in the back, I want it on. Of course, if I shut that off and make a selection again, we'll grab everything including the back faces behind the geometry. You can also select by angle, as you can see here. We can toggle it with its default set to 15 degrees. Say I select a polygon here. We'll select all polygons within 15 degrees. By the way, if you hit F2, you can also change how the polys are being shown in their selection on the model. So once again, toggling F2 can either make it so you only see the edges or the edges plus the polygons highlighted. But as I mentioned, if we come over here with the angle, we can change this to something higher. And if I select again, you'll see it'll select more based on the new angle I chose. So we can toggle it off here. And we also have on this one, select by smoothing group. So if I click on this, I can grab whatever's in smoothing group 1 or change it to smoothing group 2 and so on. I can also select on symmetrical geometry using the X, the Y, and the Z axis, but I'm not using any symmetrical geometry, so I won't be able to show you that. The last of the visibility things I want to talk about is being able to hide and show certain sections of both your model and the unwrap. So to save some time, I already made a selection. So let's just say I'm trying to unwrap this section of the object and it's a little hard to see underneath. If I come down over here and click this button, which is the display only selected polygons button, it will hide everything else and allow me to work with just that geometry. As you can see over here, it just shows the UVs that I'm using also. If I come back and click on it again, I can toggle everything back on. The button right next to it does kind of the opposite. If I actually click on this button and set it to hide, I can hide whatever I have selected. It doesn't affect what's in the viewport, but it does affect what's in the UV editor. If I want to bring it back, I just click this button, click on this eyeball, and all of my UVs come back. So the next topic I want to talk about is the transform tools found up here. The first of which is move. So if I select a UV island here, it's pretty obvious that I can just grab it and move it around. However, if you want to keep it within an axis, you can hold down Shift and you can keep it so it stays going straight up and down or left and right. You can also accomplish this by holding down your mouse on the move button up here and choosing the axis you want to restrict it to. Just remember to put it back when you're done. Next, of course, is rotation. If we select rotation, it does exactly what we think. It'll even tell us right in the middle how many degrees we're rotating. If we hold down Control, we can actually snap it in 5-degree increments. And if we hold down Alt, we can snap it in 1-degree increments. Of course, the next tool is your Scale tool. So if we click on this and select our object, we can scale it universally. If we want to restrict our scaling onto one axis, hold down Shift and you can scale it either sideways or up and down. Of course, we can do the same thing once again by holding down our mouse up here and choosing the axis we want to restrict it on. Next is the freeform mode, which lets us pretty much scale, move, and rotate in any direction we want, all without having to keep selecting a new transform tool. And lastly, we have our mirror and our flip tool found right here. If we select an object that's more obvious when it's rotating and mirroring, if we come up here and click, I can mirror it vertically, I can mirror it horizontally, I can also flip it vertically or flip it horizontally. Now, if we look at the top right corner of our UV editor, we find some additional transform tools under the quick transform section found here. The first tool is the pivot tool. If I was to say select an object and rotate it, you see it rotates around the center of the object naturally. However, if I come over here and hold down my mouse, I can choose where my pivot is going to be based on the selection. So if I want it in the bottom right corner, I can choose that there, and then come over and rotate, and it will rotate around that pivot instead of the center. Of course, this works just the same for scaling and moving transforms also. Immediately following the pivot tool is the align tools that we find right here. These tools are best designed to use vertices and edges as opposed to polygons. So I'm going to grab this little object here. I'm going to move it down. We'll zoom up on it so we can kind of see how it works. And I'm going to switch over to vertex mode and get out of element mode. From here, I'm going to grab all of these vertices that kind of make this curvy line. The way it works here is we have our horizontal and our vertical alignment. If I click on the vertical alignment, it'll take all of these vertices and straighten them out. If I was to use the horizontal alignment instead, it would compact them into one point. Of course, we don't want to do it in this situation, but if, say, I wanted some of these vertices to be perfectly flat, I can do the same thing using the horizontal tool instead of the vertical. Now, if you click and hold down on either of these two alignment tools, you'll see that there's a second option here. Let me show you how this particular option works. So if I was to say go into edge mode, and grab these edges all the way down by double clicking them. If I flatten them out vertically, you can see it does the same thing as we saw with the vertices. If I undo that and change it to the second command, it looks like it's doing the same thing, but actually something different is happening. Let me show you what I mean by that by grabbing a ring selection instead. So I'm going to undo this again. In order to grab a ring selection, you want to click on any edge, hold down Shift, and click an adjacent edge. Now if I go back and click on that same button, you'll notice that it will straighten out all of them individually, but keep them exactly where they were. So the alignment tools allow us to straighten up both vertices and edges as needed. So the next tool is the linear align tool. I'm going to come down here to this example and grab a couple sets of edges and then click the button so we can see what it does. As you can tell, it actually straightens both edge loops. But unlike the last set of align tools that create perfect vertical and horizontal lines, this tool takes the average angle of all the selected edges and straightens them to match. The next tool underneath it is the Align to Edge tool. This one works pretty simply also. Let's just say I want to rotate this object to be perfectly straight. Well, I can grab the rotation tool and try to eyeball it, but even easier yet is to select one edge that I want to align it to, click this button, and you'll see it'll straighten it out. The next set of tools are your rotational tools. So you can rotate 90 degrees counterclockwise or 90 degrees clockwise. This also rotates around the pivot, so if we change the pivot point, say come back over here to the freeform tool and click on this and move it, say to a corner, and then rotate it, you'll see it'll rotate around that pivot instead. Then the last two sets of tools that we see over here are your vertically and horizontally spacing tools. The way this works is, let's just say I want to grab a bunch of vertices here. I can grab this edge here, hold down Control, and select the vertex mode to convert my edge selection into a vert selection. Keep in mind, this method will convert any subcomponent to another. With this, I can then click on this button here, say the space horizontally, and you'll see that I actually space each one of these vertices exactly equal distance from the last. This is a little bit of an optical illusion as it doesn't look like they're spaced exactly, but they are. If I was to say grab all of them, it would do the same thing. Of course, this works the same way vertically as it does horizontally, depending on which tool you use. The next set of tools on the list are the brush tools. These tools actually help you paint and relax vertices within the UVs. They tend to work best with high poly and dense UV islands. However, I don't have any of those in my scene, so I'm not going to demo it for this video, but if you want to learn how to do it, go to Max's official documentation, which I'll link below. So the next tools after brush are Reshape elements tools. You'll actually see that the very first one, which is straighten selection, is grayed out. That's because it only works in poly mode. So I'm going to come down here, select poly mode, and now you'll see it's selectable. I'm going to grab this entire UV island here, and I'll show you what it does. When you click on this button, it will actually straighten all the lines out within the entire island. So very similar to a lot of the line tools that we found up here, it actually will do it all at once. Now keep in mind this is not a miracle tool, as it will actually create distortion quite often if you're not paying attention, but it does a pretty good job of making minor tweaks to curvy islands. I have another example here if I zoom out. You see this big object here has a lot more stuff going on. If I was to say grab this island and press the button again, you'll see that will give me some weird funky results. Keep in mind it works best with quads and long sets of loops and rings. And because this particular object did not have them, it didn't give us desired results. So if I undo that, say grab just the selection here and break it off by right-clicking and choosing break, I can move the set of UV islands off. Now with this island here, I can grab this and press the button again and get much better results because of the continuous quads, loops, and rings we see here. The last two tools over here are two different relax tools. Relax tools basically make the shape of the UVs closer to the shape of the object on the actual model. If I was to say grab this UV island here and turn on F2 so we can see it highlighted better, we can tell what's being selected on the model. Notice how our checkers are pretty off. When we use relax tools, it actually will get the shape closer and closer to the original shape of the object to make sure that the checkers actually look like boxes. So if I come over here and click this first button, which is relax until flat, we get these kind of results, which are pretty good. However, if you want more control over your relax, go to the next button. If I click over here, undo what I just did, and click on this, we have a relax custom button. If you click and hold your mouse down, however, you can grab the settings. Open up the settings and it allows you to choose different things. You can relax your island by polygon angles. If we click down the drop down, we can see also edge and centers. We can change the iterations, the amount, the stretch. We can even keep the boundaries fixed when we're relaxing. If I was to say hit start, relax, you can see it keeps going until we hit stop. Now in certain particular situations, it might keep going and going, especially if you don't have your UV islands cut in a certain way. Often I find people like to set the amount all the way up to 1 before they start to relax. Just to see what the set boundaries does, if I undo this again and click on keep the boundaries fixed and hit start relax, you'll see it keeps the outside edge seams the same, but it will relax the interior components. Either way, the relax tools, as powerful as they are, have been somewhat replaced by the peel tools, which we'll talk about a little bit later, though they're still very useful in many situations. Next on the list are the stitch tools. In order to demo this, I'm going to grab this section here, once again break it off, and move it off to the side. Now the way this works is, let's say I grab edges here, and click all the way down, we know that this edge, of course, is linked to this edge, both obviously on this pink line here on the model, but on this blue line shown in the UV island. So with these particular edges selected, if I click this button, which is stitch to target, it will move your selection to where the shared subcomponents are. If I undo that and instead choose this one, which is stitch to average, it will move both the selection and the shared subcomponents to the average distance between the two of them. And if I use this third one called stitch to source, it will move my shared subcomponents to my selection. To be fair, I find that these situations tend not to work very well, so I don't usually use the first 3 stitch tools. The last tool is my best friend, which in this case is Stitch Custom. If you click on that, it will actually move a UV island to match. So if I click here with my edges selected, it will move that other island to stitch there, and we don't get any weird distortion when it averages the 2 edges in between. Also note while stitching, edges work best. Just be sure to choose all the seam edges you want to stitch, as the tool will only connect the edges in your selection. You can even affect some of the settings by holding down the mouse, clicking over here and selecting the settings tool, which will give you a few options to change how the settings work. So the next set of tools is found under the explode section. I reset my UVs so that we can show how it works a little bit better. The first tool right here is the break tool. If I was to say grab these edges and move them, you see they're connected. However, if I click this button, they'll break, which is pretty much the same thing as if I right click and hit break over here as I showed before. The next 4 tools found here are all ways of letting Max quickly and automatically decide how to break up your unwrap for you. Just note, none of these methods are perfect, so just clicking on them and calling it a day won't give you optimal results. Rather, they'll help you get 70% of the way there, and then you'll clean up and control the rest manually. I'll explain more about that in the unwrap process video. The first of the options is flatten by polygon angle, which is set by 60 degrees by default and can't be changed. If I click on the button, you can see what happens. The next option here is flatten by smoothing group. So if you're smart and you change your smoothing groups appropriately, this one actually is pretty useful. The next one after that is flatten by material ID, so just the same as smoothing groups. If you choose material IDs, you can flatten that way also. By the way, if you don't know how to do that, you can actually come over here on the side in the Unwrap UVW modifier, and you can both set your IDs and select IDs over here. Finally, the last of the options is the custom tool, but the real power is going into the settings. So if you click and hold your mouse down and choose the settings here, it'll bring up this dialog box. This will effectively allow you to change the polygon angle threshold that you want to use. Instead of the default 60 on the polygon angle tool, it'll change the spacing, which is how much space is in between each of the UVs. It allows you to normalize clusters, which means it will resize them to fit them inside the box. It will allow you to rotate clusters. And the last one, it will fill in any holes within the UVs themselves. So if I click on this and say shut off by material IDs here and hit OK, you'll see the empty space of these UVs are filled in with other smaller UV islands. Underneath the flattening tools is the weld tools found here. You'll actually see that if you don't have vertices selected, you won't be allowed to target weld. However, you can choose the next option on the side, which is weld subcomponent. If I say grab these 2 objects here, and then click this button, I can weld those 2 subcomponents together, all depending on the threshold that I have set here if the distance is appropriate. If nothing works when you click on it, just increase the threshold. Now let me undo that. The other option, which if I click on the vertex mode here, will then be highlighted, which is target weld. If I click on that, I can grab any vertice, and then you see the W on the icon, move it over and weld it to another object over here. If I do the same thing to this top part over here, you'll see that this green line now turns white because it's welded together. You can do the same thing by right-clicking and choosing Target Weld here, or you can also highlight a couple of objects and click Weld Selected, which works the same as our welding subcomponents here. The next section is Peel, which is found here. It's a pretty important section in my opinion, because as I mentioned before, it replaces the Relax tools with more modern tools. So let's see how this whole thing works. If I say come up over here and grab this particular UV island, move it up, and let's just say we mush it or so a little bit, so that we're having some stretching UVs over here. If I was to press the quick peel button, you'll see what it does. It actually fixes up the UVs pretty well. Now what it does is it also fits it within the UV box, but it fits it based on what was selected. In this case, I only have 1 UV island, so it'll scale it up large and fit it within the UV box. If I was to say move it out of the box, you can kind of see how it looks. It's obviously way larger than anything else, so the textile density is a bit off. That's why we're seeing more boxes in here. But really the point is to show how powerful this tool is, as it automatically relaxes things for us. Immediately following quick peel over here is the peel mode. To demo this, I'm going to use this object right here. I'm going to select it, turn on peel mode, and kind of move it down so we can see what's going on. Now you might notice it does the same thing as quick peel, except for now it's actually active and allows us to manipulate our UV island in real time. You might also notice these 2 blue vertices, which are actually known as pins. In order to manipulate them, we can only do that in vertex mode. So I'm going to come down here and click on vertex mode. Now you might also notice that by default this button is on, which is auto pin move vertices. This means if I select any vertices, they automatically become pins. I'm going to shut this off right now to demo how these pins work. So if I say grab one of these pins here and move it, you can see how it manipulates the UV island. Of course, with only 2 pins, it can only do so much. If I was to say add a new pin, say grab a new vertice, which by the way, I can't move unless it becomes a pin, I can come down here and click on pin selected and turn that vertice into a pin also. Now if I was to say move this pin around, you can see how it manipulates the UV island a little bit differently. We of course can select new vertices and press this button to add new pins, or as I mentioned before, just leave this auto pin on so every time I select a vertice, it automatically turns into a pin that allows us to manipulate our object. You can also delete pins by clicking this button here. Lastly, I'm not really sure if there's a way to do it properly, but the only way I know how to get rid of the pins themselves within the UV editor is to shut it off, flatten out the editor, and add a new Unwrap UVW and open that up, which now you can see the blue pins are gone. You might have noticed by now that the peel tools can likewise be found over here on the modifier. You can also tell that there's some extra buttons including pelt mode. While the pelt tool used to be pretty useful, I feel that peel mode has completely replaced it. There's also some tools down here under seams that help us manipulate our seams real time. So let me show you how these work. The first of which is the edit seams button right here. If you click on that and actually go into your model and I press F4 to bring up my lines, anytime I click on an edge, it's going to turn that edge into a seam, which is highlighted blue within the editor. Now if I use the peel mode, it will automatically use that as a seam when it makes its calculations. You can also click on the point-to-point seam editor right here. This allows us to click one point and then another point and it'll draw a seam between the two. For example, if I was to say zoom up over here and click up at the top and then go all the way down to the bottom, it will turn that into a seam. You'll also notice in real time it will show you what it's going to do when you click on any point with an orange preview line. Then the last tool, which only works in edge mode over here, is convert edge into a selection. This basically means if I'm just going around and clicking on edges, if I press this button, it will automatically convert them into a seam. The next section of tools within the UV editor is the arrange elements found here. This also happens to be some of the more important tools found within the program. As the name suggests, this is actually a way to automatically pack our UVs to help us save some time. The UVs that you see in my scene right now were done using quick peel, and you can tell that they're not packed very efficiently. The most important of all the buttons is actually this one right here, which is our pack custom. Now just pressing it will pack our UVs, but if we click and hold our mouse down, we can change the settings that control more of the things that we need to do. The first is the type of packing. I find in general non-convex, which is the default, works the best. The padding is the distance in between the UVs, which was mentioned previously in one of my other videos. I've actually set it to 0.001. The next three, which is normalize, rotate, and fill holes, have all been described in previous tools. The one new checkbox is rescale clusters. What rescale clusters does is it allows Max to scale the UV islands in relation to each other, resulting in a perfect one-to-one texel density. So unless there's a particular reason why you want your texel density different, leaving this on can be extremely helpful. Once you have all the settings the way that you want, click OK, and you'll see the results are pretty good. The tool immediately following the pack custom is the Rescale Elements button, which is basically the same thing as that checkbox I just mentioned. It's a way to take all of your elements and make them one-to-one as far as texel density is concerned. The last area in the UV editor is the Element Properties area, which allows you to group UV islands together, keeping their proximity and scale in relation to each other, even when you're using the automatic packing tools that we just saw. For example, if I was to say take this object over here, and this other UV island here and place them side by side, perhaps even mirroring them, so it kind of looks like a 96. And then say grab this object here and this object and scale it up. If I was to say grab both of these items and group them using this button and take these two items and group them using this button. Now if I select all my UVs with Control A and press the Pack Custom tool, you'll see I'll pack my UVs together, but notice how it kept these two items together in their same relation, and the same thing over here. I actually changed the texel density on this outer ring when I scaled it up. Notice after I hit the pack button, even though it had rescale clusters on, it didn't automatically update the texel density. So remember, groups keep the relative size and proportions of the UV islands together, even after using automatic packing tools. Now, of course, if I want these groups to be broken, I can select them and click this button here and unselect a group, or I can select groups pressing this button here. So I want to wrap up this video by showing all the rest of the stuff that's left on the Unwrap modifier itself since we finished the editor. So coming over here on the side, going to the first thing we haven't talked about yet is this button right here, which is Quick Planer. This is actually a quick and easy way to create a UV island without doing the automatic tools. So if say I wanted to grab a bunch of polygons on my geometry here, so we open this up and we have in polygon mode and I grab all of these, I can automatically make a UV island out of them by pressing this Quick Planer button. This also helps quite often when you're having issues with a certain section. If you want to kind of reset it or fix it. By the way, don't forget to relax your UVs after using Quick Planer because it doesn't do that for you automatically, as it just takes the selection and stretches and scales it to fit within the UV box. Next is channels. The channels section basically allows you to have more than one set of UVs on an object at the same time, so you can actually set a second channel and so on. This way you can have your normal UVs on one channel and then maybe like light map UVs on the second channel or whatever. After that is the projection tools. These are pretty outdated, but just like how we had that quick planar before, you can do a planar selection, a cylindrical, a spherical map, and a box map, and then a bunch of other settings that kind of help them out. But as I mentioned, they're a little bit outdated now. The next set of tools under wrap are basically useful for spline modeling and for unwrapping a strip such as a road or a highway or something like that. I don't have any of that kind of geometry in my scene, so check out the official 3D Studio Max documentation if you want to learn more. And lastly, we have some visual options for our seams down here, which allows us to turn on and off our seams within the editor, as you can see here. It also can shut off the peel seams, which are those blue seams we saw before, on and off with this checkbox. Lastly, you can make them either thick or thin by choosing these two options. If I thin them out, you'll see it makes them a little bit smaller. So that basically wraps up everything I wanted to talk about as far as the tools go within the editor and the modifier itself. So hopefully this was helpful, and I will see you guys in the next video.